Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Ronayne. I'm president of University Circle Incorporated, and it is my pleasure to introduce Mobility in the Modern Era. This is the first of a four-part series that University Circle Incorporated is featuring, and we're glad you're with us today. We have 165 participants signed up for today's first of a four-part series in our symposium, and you're coming from states all around the country and, of course, from neighborhoods all around our region. We're glad you're here. I'm glad in a minute to introduce my colleague Annie Pease, and she'll give an introduction to our featured speaker today, Angie Schmitt, and we're looking forward to a fast hour of discussion about what's transforming our world, transportation. So in this series, we are introducing the four speakers over the next 4 months, but first is going to be Angie Schmitt today, formerly of Streets Blog. She is a journalist and a planner by background and has just hatched a new book called Right of Way. We'll come back to Angie in just a minute. Kim Lucas of City of Pittsburgh is going to be with us talking about innovation in transportation. Will Burns of Spin is going to talk with us about shared mobility, and Cleve Ricksecker, our friend down at Columbus Capitol Crossroads, is going to talk about business partnerships in, again, how we are looking at transportation and its transformation in the modern era of cities. So University Circle, just to give those from out of town a little bit of a overview of who we are, we're a 1 square mile area, proudly in the city of Cleveland, within walking proximate distance of some great neighborhoods of Cleveland. And we do focus on this being a day to talk more about a multimodal environment, the 20-minute walk to Shaker Square, the 10-minute walk up to Coventry, to downtown and to Lake Erie. That's University Circle. It has been a very high-performing district here in the state of Ohio over the last decade, thanks to these eds, meds, and arts institutions that have really grown employment-wise. It wasn't too long ago that University Hospitals and the Cleveland Clinic didn't make the top 20 list of top 20 Cleveland employers. Today, Cleveland Clinic is the #1 employer here, and University Hospitals not far behind is the #2 employer. We are a place of 3 colleges, looking forward to a return carefully and socially distant of our students, but they're coming back in 2 weeks at Case Western Reserve, Cleveland Institute of Music, and Institute of Art, and then a dozen arts and cultural institutions that were placed here by design in proximity to one another to create this vibrant, innovative district where, as one colleague called it, it's a collaboratory of people with ideas advancing this world. So who are we? University Circle Incorporated. We are a development service and advocacy company. We call ourselves a community service corporation. Our priorities over our 6 decades of existence have been about community education, about community development, about community safety, and certainly about community transportation, which more and more is shaping the way we think about how we plan the places around us. So with that, here's one of our famed residents in the neighborhood. This is one of a gift of one of Rodin's thinkers, who sits right outside the 1916 Cleveland Museum of Art front door. And what's he thinking about? Well, maybe he's thinking about how transportation is transforming cities. From places that look like anyhow town anywhere, places of sprawl, to places of density. You know, today 3/4 of millennials say they prefer to live in an urban area. How are we responding to that? When you look at this building, One University Circle, it was built by a company by the name First Interstate. Somewhat of an irony, but in the very first bullet point of their sales brochures, First Interstate talked about located at the front door of the Health Line, BRT. Things are changing. We're moving maybe from the kind of places that led everybody home to nowhere, that led everybody to a highway to get somewhere, only to find a place that looked like everywhere else. We're moving from that kind of traffic to transit. Again, we're 10 billion people in the last couple of years has hopped on public transit, wants to be connected by more ways than just a single occupancy vehicle. It's certainly the will of our upcoming generations, the millennial generation, the Gen Z behind them. So what are we doing to adapt to that? going from places that we may have grown up in, with the two-car garage on the cul-de-sac, from everything being a ride from and back into the garage, to bike trips. When you look at the fact that teenagers today are less and less inclined to go out and immediately get their driver's license, they're thinking about different ways to get around: a bike, a bus, a walk. So how are we thinking about it in terms of the places that we are in? Brookings tells us that these 13 megapolitan regions in our country are churning out the majority of GDP and ideas. They're the innovation centers around the landscape of the nation. And within those innovation regions are these tiny pockets of innovation districts where density does matter. People being around people, a beehive of ideas, exchanging, where not everything has to happen from a one-car movement to a garage and back, where things can happen when people use a system of transportation to walk, to bike share, to shuttle transport, to and from place. We're building a lot of housing here in University Circle that isn't actually bringing with it a garage. We're getting zoning variances to do it. How's the rest of our world responding? Maybe the way we've always done business, from the federal, state to municipal paradigm, driving down policy, is changing. I'm thinking a little bit about this presidential debate that's coming up right at our western neighborhood of University Circle, at the Cleveland Clinic, at the health education campus with Case Western and the Cleveland Clinic. What would we say to our candidates about how cities are changing? Well, we might say that listen to neighborhoods, how neighborhoods are idea centers, distributing those ideas through regional distributorships to a global marketplace where the world matters, the exchange of ideas matter, people near people matter. What also matters, and the topic of today is about transportation safety. Right outside the doors of what will be the September 29th first presidential debate is a wonderful set of neighborhoods, from Huff to Midtown to Fairfax to University Circle, and the Cleveland Clinic right in between. Sadly, right outside those doors has been a place where we've had too many encounters of traffic crashes. In one case specifically, right up the street, a traffic fatality. When you look at fatalities, persons hit by automobiles over the last decade, we're up 60% from where we were in 2009. We're at the highest rate of pedestrian fatality in 30 years in this country, with 6,590 pedestrians struck and killed in America last year. In Cuyahoga County, our home county, we're averaging, sadly, about 20 deaths a year. How can we change this trajectory from the tragedy that it is to a better multimodal, walkable place here in a place like University Circle and beyond? We're working on it here in University Circle, and it's my pleasure to introduce now our transportation director, Annie Pease, who's going to run through some of the ideas that we've been working through together. We had a great morning with Annie. We had a bike giveaway. 24 students participated in a learn and earn, and they received a community gift today from University Circle and the University Circle Police with our Pedal with Police program. We gave away bikes to students. Now it's about how we plan our communities to assure that those students who are riding out in our city streets are safe. Annie Pease, Director of Transportation, take it away with you go, and then I'll have you introduce Angie Schmitt. Thank you, Annie.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Pease. As Chris mentioned, I'm the Director of Transportation at University Circle Incorporated. I am very excited that we are launching the Mobility in the Modern Era series with a talk focused on pedestrian safety. And before I introduce our guest expert speaker, I'm going to share a few slides to provide some context on UCI's transportation work. This slide shows the 3 key pillars, and I'm going to go through quickly each pillar one by one. So as a co-sponsor of the series, UGO is University Circle's Sustainable Transportation Initiative. UGOinthecircle.com is a website that has a lot of information about the options available and how they work for travel to and around University Circle. You see on the right some of the features on the website, but for those who aren't familiar, I highly recommend checking it out. We also have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for through the website and receive regular updates around what's going on, what's changing, and what's coming next in the Circle. In terms of our services, another pillar is the reliability and availability of transportation services to get people from A to B. The CircleLink shuttle is pictured in the top left here of your screen. It's our free public shuttle that operates between the VA hospital and the Coventry neighborhood. It runs every 30 minutes. It is free to ride for passengers, and the service is made possible with the financial backing of institutions in the circle. The CircleLink shuttle is an example of a route that was previously more of a district circulator, going from the museums up to Uptown and back, connecting students with different spots across campus. And since its extension into the Coventry neighborhood, has truly become a commute option, a viable commute option for people who live near work. And that's a really exciting thing, and the direction we'd love to see more of our transportation services going throughout the neighborhood. The third pillar, and the one that's most relevant to our talk here today, is the infrastructure side of transportation. And over the last few years, UCI has worked very closely with public agencies, our institutional partners, and the community to move ahead some pedestrian, transit, and bike-friendly projects that have been recommended through a district-wide transportation and mobility plan. These pictures show some recent examples of these projects. The image on the left is Ford Drive, and we worked closely with the City of Cleveland to have a striping plan that has 10-foot wide travel lanes, narrower than they were before, made possible by a wider median, shared pavement markings there, and an enhanced crosswalk at the Nash Walkway with flashing lights to indicate to oncoming motorists that will be an area where lots of pedestrians will be crossing, especially as students are back on campus and moving about. The image on the right shows some new pavement markings and bike signage in the Uptown neighborhood on Euclid Avenue. So while we feel like we have come a really long way, especially in recent years, on some of these pedestrian, bike, transit-friendly enhancements, we know we have a long way to go. And this was made very apparent last winter, where between November of 2019 and February of 2020, UCI was made aware of 7 incidences where pedestrians were struck or nearly struck by oncoming motorists while crossing the street in marked crosswalks. So the blue circles on this map show the spots where pedestrians were injured with those conflicts, and the red circles unfortunately show where pedestrians were killed while crossing the street in a marked crosswalk. And so upon learning about this, we looked at the data over the last 5 years to better understand if last winter was an anomaly, if it was unusual, or if those patterns bore themselves out year after year. And upon looking at the last 5 years of data, these are the last 5 full years of data, we discovered that while the total number of crashes in University Circle has gone down by 25%, the number of crashes involving pedestrians has gone up by 33%. And the severity of crashes has also increased by 140%. So these are startling statistics. This map shows those data points mapped out on a map of University Circle. Each point represents a crash, and the red dots represent fatal crashes. The small blue dots represent more crashes that result in property damage, no injury. The map on the left there shows all crashes, and the map on the right shows crashes that involve a pedestrian. And sometimes when we look at maps like this, we're looking for trends and we're looking for hot spots. But an important thing to remember is that every one of these crashes involves people. And in all crashes in University Circle over the last 5 years, 25 of those resulted in someone being injured. Sometimes sustaining an injury that lasts their whole life, sometimes a broken bone, but 25% results in injuries. And when we look at that map that shows pedestrian crashes, 90% of crashes involving pedestrians in University Circle over the last 5 years resulted in injuries. So our data really bears out the vulnerability that humans using the public right-of-way, people in the streets, are subject to while traveling. So in response to much of what we learned or were made more aware of last winter, UCI has developed a crash response task force of our staff. When we learn about a crash that results in injury or is severe, involves a pedestrian, we send a team of our staff out to evaluate the area and identify any near-term improvements we can make in the spot. Are there speed limit signs there? Are we missing signs? Is the striping off? Are the lights operable? We're collecting some speed data using a radar device, so be mindful of your speed as you travel through University Circle these days. And we're also developing a metric for reporting streetlight outages. So we understand in the winter especially, areas like University Circle have a high number of travelers, a lot of commuter traffic, and is always walkable. There's always a lot of pedestrians walking through the district. And in the wintertime, that heavy pedestrian traffic is at conflict with heavy commuter traffic. So the functionality of the streetlights is really important, that the right-of-way is lit and well illuminated. The images on the right show projects that take a longer amount of time, but are really driven by some of the data that we're collecting and are being really mindful towards. That image on the left is a curb extension. It's a green infrastructure project that UCI led in partnership with RTA, the Sewer District, the City of Cleveland, and Cleveland Schools. And this is a crossing and enhancement that reduced the number of crossings for students arriving to their school by RTA. Had to cross the Euclid, for anyone familiar with the area, you know this intersection, the Carnegie, Cedar, and MLK intersection, 6 times across the street in crosswalks. And this project reduced the number of crossings to 2 to get from the RTA station over to the schools, and also reduced the width of the street on MLK from 4 lanes to 3. So a major improvement, and we're very thankful to our partners who helped us with this and the staff at UCI who was pushing for it. The image on the right shows a painted bump out along Mayfield Road in Little Italy with flexible bollards. This is a really important pedestrian safety enhancement as it physically prevents cars from parking too close, parking illegally, and too close to the cross streets there. So a small enhancement that has a big impact on the overall feel of the street, the safety of the street, and bears a big impact on that infrastructure, built environment side of the 3 legs of our stool. So we know we have a lot to learn, and I'm really excited now to turn this presentation over to our guest expert speaker, Angie Schmitt. Angie Schmitt is a woman who wears many hats. As a longtime journalist and national editor with Streets blog, Angie's articles have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, City Lab, and the Columbus Journalism Review, as well as NPR. Angie recently wrote a book published by Island Press called Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. Most recently, Angie is a pedestrian safety consultant through her firm, 3MPH Planning and Consulting. Angie lives in Cleveland with her family and is also a graduate of CSU's Levin College of Urban Affairs. We're really excited to welcome Angie. I want to notify all attendees that if you have questions throughout Angie's presentation, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Following Angie's presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A. Additionally, we are offering professional engineering and AICP urban planning credits. So there will be information at the end of the presentation for anyone seeking professional credits about how to obtain them. So stay tuned. And without further ado, I'll introduce Angie Schmitt. Angie, welcome.
So I really appreciate that introduction, and I wasn't aware of all that's going on in University Circle, especially some of that street, that work you've done, that really fine grain level improvements out on the street. And I think that's really inspiring. And one of the big points I try to make in my book is that's exactly sort of the kind of thing we need. So with that, I'm just gonna go right into this presentation. Let me get this, set up. Oops. Sorry, I think I have to share screen first. Okay. Yeah, and thanks for mentioning my book. That is coming out next month. It's published by Island Press. So I'm going to get started talking a little bit about the history of streets and how they've evolved. And one of my goals with this presentation is to get people to sort of change the way we think about streets, because I think that's a big barrier to addressing this problem, and also to some of the related problems that come with it, including lack of physical activity, high levels of pollution, and a little bit isolation. A lot of things, a lot of societal problems that contribute to sort of the lack of public space and the way that's been eroded in recent years. So this is a picture I want to take you way back. This is a historical picture of Cleveland. It's actually Euclid near East 6th Street in 1930. And I just want everyone to sort of take a look at what's happening here and notice, one thing you notice is, I want everyone to notice, is just how relaxed these pedestrians look crossing the street. At this point, there may not have been a need. I believe at this time, there wouldn't have been any crosswalks at all. Pedestrians had sort of free roam to travel wherever they wanted on the street. And it was, streets at that time were sort of a social space. You might stop and talk to someone when you're getting on the streetcar. And you notice sort of the density of people is another thing I want you to notice. Like, look how teeming the sidewalks are. Now, obviously, this is a very high point in Cleveland's history, and a lot of things have changed, but the density of people compared to cars is another thing I want you to notice. So moving along, another historic use of streets, and this example isn't from Cleveland, but they used to also be a place for children. Children would play in the street. And there was other activities, commercial activities would take place. Street vendors were a bigger tradition back then. But around this time and a little bit later is when cars sort of came on the scene in American cities in a really big way. And this is Carnegie Avenue in Cleveland, just about 15 years later. This is in 1946. You can see the entire environment has been transformed. You don't see any people, nobody's on the sidewalk, and now the landscape is dominated by cars. So I think that for a long time that continued, and it's shaped our landscape in so many profound ways. It's almost invisible to us at this point. But I want, one of the goals of this presentation, like I said, is to get people to sort of think critically about that and think about what possibilities there are if we can sort of change the way we conceptualize this a little bit, get some of that back. Now, as this has happened, as we transformed from a nation of walkers and streetcar riders to a nation of drivers, what's happened is pedestrians have really gotten squeezed. And this is just an illustration, I think, that does a good job of showing how marginalized pedestrians have become and how much sort of their safety is so fragile. Here's a shot. We head out to the suburbs. This was shot in North Olmsted, right outside the mall. I think this is the reality for a lot of people in the United States. This gentleman doesn't have a crosswalk and is just like sprinting for his life. And one thing I think is relevant to the discussion, and one of my big theories as I'm doing this research and writing this book, is I think most of us that are in positions of authority, most of us that have a little bit of money, middle class and above, a lot of even poorer people, just are not put in this position. It really is sort of the poorest folks with disabilities, that end up in these situations trying to cross these very wide roads. And a lot of the rest of us are able to avoid the situation at all, either by living in a place that offers safer infrastructure, or just by driving. So I think there's a little bit, those of us that aren't in this position ourselves every day, there's a little bit of insensitivity about it, and just because we're not put in that position ourselves. So this gets to the topic of my book, which is pedestrian deaths and the way they've been climbing in the United States. And here's a chart that shows the pattern we've seen. And one thing I want to note about this is it's unusual in the United States to see traffic deaths climb this way and to climb so dramatically. Since the 1970s, since sort of the Ralph Nader era, we've seen, for the most part, gradually improving traffic safety outcomes. although our outcomes are still a lot worse than comparable nations, this is really unexpected escalation. And for a long time, even people that followed this closely sort of warned what was causing it or thought it was an aberration a couple of years, but now the pattern is it's really entrenched, and it seems like it's here to stay. So one of my goals with the book was to try and explain why this was happening. I'm going to walk you through that a little bit. So one of the things that's going on in these cars have just gotten a lot bigger. Since we emerged from the last recession, a lot of Americans have traded their sedans, smaller cars for SUVs. And there's some recent data showing that SUVs are 2.5 times more likely to kill pedestrians when they're shook. So that could help explain, you know, some of the data that Annie referenced, how pedestrian injuries are climbing while car deaths auto injuries are declining. One of the factors cars have gotten, this is my son, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this over the years, but this is my son when he was 4. He's a limited Ford F-250, and these enormous trucks are just everywhere now. They have big spots that are especially for. So another thing happening and contributing to this trend, I think, is we have
We are in contact with Angie to get her back, to get that connection. We hope back and the volume up. Back with you in just a minute. Annie, I may come to you while we're picking back up with Angie and have a little bit of a dialogue to continue as we pull Angie back in.
Sure.
You know, a little bit, I'd like to appeal to you relative to your expertise as our transportation director, a little bit about this culture shift that Angie was beginning to talk about, how at one point there was a culture of the streets that seemed shared prior to the 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond. And then we moved into a time when it seemed like it became unilateral relative to the four-wheeled vehicle. Angie, are you back? I was just doing well, as Angie picks back up, I think this issue of how do we change the trajectory and the culture of the street back, it's a real work in progress. University Circle, as an example, is a place where we welcome students, researchers, and residents from all over the globe. And they're used to places in other countries of the world where there's a little bit more parity on the use of streets. I will never forget being in Havana a few years back and seeing that stickball in the streets is still alive and well. And yet we're very quick to run a kid off the street who might be playing ball in our streets. We're very quick to reassert by every which way possible that curb to curb, this isn't your place. I just wonder if you can comment on that and that whole culture of where we are with our streets today.
Yes, it's interesting. I think in cities, especially on residential streets, the culture is a little bit different. And I think the pandemic has made this a little bit more evident as more people are at home, their kids are at home, and they are looking to get outside. People are biking in numbers now, like we haven't seen in recent years. They're walking a lot. Getting outside and taking a spin around your neighborhood is, that's your spot.
Yeah.
And I think that view that people have of the street, and kind of, you know, our sidewalks aren't built to maintain a 6-foot physical distance from the person you're approaching in most places. And that bears an impact when people in mass are kind of looking for something different and looking at the space immediately around their house is different. I think in urban areas at least, the residential streets, I think are good opportunity.
Yes. Angie, we got into a conversation about the culture of streets, just playing right off of what you were presenting, and that sea change that occurred in the mid 20th century. And hopefully as we move into 21st century decades ahead, that sea change will work back toward where we were with a bit of more parity on the use of streets. But I don't know if you want to pull back up your presentation or if that's...
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm so sorry. Hopefully we won't have that.
No worries.
Again.
Come on back.
So I'm sorry, I need to share my screen.
You got it. I'll pull off.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so did you guys see this slide?
We did.
Okay, so I'm just talking about how we've seen our suburbs become more diverse. And this is a national trend. And I think, like, unless you really look at the maps, it's hard to understand how dramatic this has been. But we've become more diverse in suburban areas, and suburban areas are more dangerous for pedestrians. So that's one of the reasons I think nationally we're seeing this big increase. There's a lot more people that are relying on transit out in areas like that man in North Olmsted who are, you know, just running for their lives on streets that have never really made any effort to make accommodations for them. The next slide, I want to take a look at how, so obviously this is a map of racial segregation. So I'm trying to show, you know, how that's evolved a little bit. And then also, this is a map by Cleveland and some other groups produces of the most dangerous road segments in Cleveland. And I just want you to notice that they match up pretty closely with concentrations of people of color in the region. So it's also, as referenced in the title of my book, this is a racial equity issue as well. And part of the reason Black people and Latino people are more likely to be killed while they're walking, also Native people, is because of racism, structural racism, and certain roads, and I think like Superior is a good example. We'll see a photo of that later in the presentation. That went through predominantly Black neighborhoods, were very, very highway-like. The communities that were bisected didn't have the political power to demand, you know, safer, more pleasant conditions. And we're sort of living with the aftermath of that in a lot of ways. So in the next phase of the presentation, I want to talk about how we're doing better and a vision for, you know, a more sustainable, more just vision for our streets. And this is a woman named Jeanette Sadiq Khan. She was the former transportation commissioner of New York City, and she's sort of a celebrity in the field. She's sitting there on Times Square, and I want to talk a little bit about an experiment they did there years ago that was really groundbreaking. This happened in 2009. She worked under Mayor Bloomberg. So in 2009, or prior to 2009, this is what Times Square looked like. Again, and if you go back to the first slide that I presented, notice the density of people. Times Square has many more pedestrians a day than it sees cars. But the space, you know, one of her insights was noticing that the distribution of space was really unjust. Pedestrians, you know, a lot of them are tourists at Times Square, are really sort of squished onto these little strips of concrete next to, and then the taxis occupy most of the space. Most of the space was for them. So she decided to sort of mix this up and change this. And she used something called tactical urbanism, which is a short-term pilot demonstration to sort of toy with how it could be different. And that was a 3-month pilot in 2009. These chairs were purchased from just like a Home Depot. And so she converted a large portion of Times Square, of land that had formerly been street space for cars, into a pedestrian plaza, and people had room to spread out. This is a photo from the New York Times, and it shows, you know, a little kid watching a movie there on Times Square. So it ended up being very popular. Retail rents increased, and they made it permanent. And she's been doing this, and since then she's no longer in charge at the DOT in New York, but she went about doing this across the city, taking land that formerly was just used for cars. And in New York City, only about 50% of folks even have cars in their household. So it was, cars occupied a lot more space than rightfully they might have. And she went about changing that a little bit and carving out these spaces. And I just think it's a cool example, and it's changed the way people think about these issues nationally. This is a pedestrian plaza that was created in Brooklyn, and these were relatively cheap installations. The base there is just paint and sand, epoxy. The green paint on the ground is used sort of as the base, and then there's some concrete planters around the outside, and that's what prevents cars from crashing into everybody who's standing there. So this was done across the city, and they actually in 2018 saw pedestrian deaths fall to the lowest level in 100 years, pretty much since the introduction of cars in the city. So they've had a lot of success. Now I wanna run through some examples of what other cities have done to sort of reclaim some of this space that was once just for vehicle traffic. This is Seattle, as it's noted. And in that city, they've done a lot of really innovative things. But this is one of the uses. They allow schools to take over the street and have field days. And it's a pretty simple permitting process. So this is something, as we're dealing with effects of COVID, that maybe we should be thinking about more. There's some good local examples too. This is in Akron. They recently, I don't know how many people know this, they recently decommissioned a highway, the Interbelt, the Akron Interbelt. It was, you know, built in the highway era, the urban renewal era, and was carrying so few cars that they decided that the access roads could handle all the vehicle traffic easily. So they've since decommissioned this highway. But prior to that, they had this big event where they sat 500 people down in the middle of the highway and started talking about what could be an alternative use for this space for us? How could we use this space to better serve the community? And I want to give a shout out to Cleveland's Healthline, which I think is a great example that a lot of people look up to nationally, but that we take for granted here in Cleveland. But this is another example. Here we took 2 lanes out of Euclid, and there's some grumbling about this, but the Healthline carries about 14, or prior to Corona, carried about 14,500 riders a day. So it's moving a lot of people. You can move a lot of people in a bus. It's more spatially efficient than a car. So by giving them the right of way, I think these are probably 2 of the most efficient, best used people moving road lanes in the whole city outside highways. So a little shout out to them. I referenced this earlier. This is one of the streets that's one of the most dangerous that was listed on that slide. That's been identified by Vision Zero. You can sort of see why. It's so wide, there's no median, it's superior. But there are people thinking about how can we transform this even in Cleveland. So here's an example that's called the Midway. And there's a group calling for, and I believe a portion of this is funded through NOACA, and that project should get started in a few years. But here's a vision of how it could be more humane. And this Midway proposal, they call it, it actually, a lot of these streets that are more dangerous in Cleveland, they were formerly streetcar right-of-ways. So it used to be that a streetcar went down Superior and it ran right down the middle of the street. And when they decommissioned the streetcar, they just paved that whole area. And that's why it's so wide and unwieldy and dangerous. Wide streets encourage speeding, and speeding is very dangerous for pedestrians. So here's an example of something cool you could do to make it a little more livable for the people nearby, safer for pedestrians. Anytime you add something in the middle of the road that gives them a little bit of a refuge, that's a big benefit, especially on a big wide street like that. So as we've entered this COVID era, which is so horrifying. More and more cities are doing this. They're taking road space, you know, that once was for cars. And this is Market Avenue for folks that aren't from Cleveland, outside the West Side Market. It's a big tourist spot in Cleveland, a big dining destination. And it was able to be easily converted into outdoor dining space to support some of those businesses and those restaurants right nearby. So that's happening sort of around the country. It's happening there on West 25th in other areas as well. And it's helped us be more resilient and respond to the crisis that we're facing right now. So I'm going to start wrapping up in a little bit, but one thing I wanted to note is while this kind of stuff is nice, we're not going to impact pedestrian fatalities too much unless we get out of some of the wealthier areas, some of the places where the more well-to-do people live, and get out to some of the places where most people are more reliant on transit to do these kind of interventions. And some of the ones that Annie described in the introduction are exactly, I think, the kind of thing that are needed. This is recommended by FHWA. They say these pedestrian islands can be constructed cheaply and easily. It just really takes effort, and it takes sort of an acknowledgement of the problem and caring, and that's sort of what we've been lacking so far. But it would be easy to do this kind of thing in a lot more places. It does take a little bit of money and a little bit of political will. But here's another example. It's not a very good photo, but I just loved it so much that they show it in front of a school. This is the kind of thing that should be standard in front of every school. You know, if we care about protecting children and their sort of freedom. So these little elements that have been missing, going back and adding those, just the way Annie described and the way they're doing it at University Circle Inc. That's really what I recommend. And she even, I was impressed, she even mentioned streetlights, which is a big issue. 75% of pedestrians are killed at night. And I think a lot of us, going back to what I mentioned earlier about sort of being in privileged positions where we're not relying on the bus, you know, at night and coming home from the grocery store with young children at night, some of us who are in more influential positions, most of us have streetlights that work in our neighborhood, but that's not true for everyone. So we have to go back and sort of fill in those missing pieces, I think, if we want to get this problem under control. And with that, I just do a little pitch for my book. Like I mentioned, it's out next month from Island Press. It's available for pre-order now. And you can get a 20% discount for attending this if you use my last name, if you want to order that. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Angie. We're going to open it up for Q&A now, and I think virtual applause for you and the advocacy that you've done starting right here at home in Cleveland. And it was exciting to see that you put some Cleveland-based projects that you think have moved the needle, from the BRT to the planned Midway to the Market Street improvements. We'll just join you now on video. So it's within us as a community to make these place-based improvements. You also brought out New York City, Jeanette Seda-Khan's work as transportation director with Mayor Bloomberg, and it seems also, as you said, a matter of will, sometimes finding the money for the great idea. But it seems like in our town, we're getting there on some fronts and still have work to do. And even the little things you mentioned, just lighting, place-based improvements that are the simple things that make for safer passersby. I wonder if you can go outside of New York and outside of Cleveland, and as you've reflected in your book, on places that are moving in a more modernizing way with transportation, and tell us any more places that you found that have really kind of found a way to kind of move us forward in this century in a more multimodal, safer, shared way of infrastructure in the streets.
Yeah, one of the big leaders is Seattle, who's really invested a lot in transit. And they're doing all kinds of innovative stuff with their streets. In the presentation, there was the example of play streets, which I think is so cool. But they use different elements, and they really involve the community. So like a neighborhood might apply and say, we want to do a play street, we want to do a block party, or we want to do a traffic circle and we'll do the landscaping for it. So I think that's really cool and innovative. They've even closed down a few streets and just like turn them into lawns in certain areas, very, you know, dead end streets or that kind of thing, just so residential areas have more green space and kids can play and that kind of thing. So Seattle's a good example. I also, one of the examples in my book that I highlight is Detroit. They had some big success on pedestrian safety that was sort of unintended, I think, but they did just a few years ago in Detroit, about 40% of their traffic light or street lights were just burnt out. They weren't working, they weren't operational. And they finally got together with the state and said, we're gonna do something about this. And they issued $185 million in bonds to get those all working. And it was a little bit about safety too, like personal safety from crime and that kind of thing. But once they did that, pedestrian deaths declined dramatically. About 40%, and deaths in unlighted conditions almost disappeared overnight. So it's a big success story from a city we don't usually think of as a leader.
Yeah. It sounds like it's the spectrum of the sort of culture of streets and how they're used all the way through to the audit of our actual infrastructure and what we need. We talked a little offline before about developing sort of neighborhood audits of as you said, is the lighting appropriate? And frankly, in some of the places that we've seen crashes, there's work that needs to be done. I'm going to take this to our audience, and I want to thank also Cleveland section of the American Planning Association. It's one of our co-sponsors with Hugo and our University Circle team as well. And as you saw, credits are available for hearing the wisdom of Angie Schmitt today. So I do want to point out before we get moving, there is change happening all the time. I got a message from Kim Lever, planning director in North Olmsted, who said that right at Great Northern and Country Club, they are actually making improvements right where you placed the person that was running in that intersection or no intersection across the street. So she says they are making improvements. So there's hope. Did want to go to a couple of questions that are very timely, the times we're in. And that is, one from the field is, you know, noting, and I'm going to paraphrase Matt Schmitt here, but noting that with COVID, the streets are less congested, but perhaps no surprise, people are speeding up in that dynamic as his observations. And he's a neighbor of yours, by the way, out in Detroit Shoreway, and I'm right down the street from you guys. I've seen the same. What about this whole uptick of traffic movements? And maybe it just comes back to this issue of necking down right of way to kind of get to the point where people aren't able to just, you know, freely drive 55 on a 35. Yeah. But that's been an observation I'm sure a lot of us have had, that in COVID, less congestion, but higher speeds.
Yeah, that's really true. A lot of the data bears that out. And I think that was one of the reasons people were pushing for narrowing the right of way with the little restaurant cafes. Those are called parklets. And people have used those before, going back years. I think it's a good idea. And it's a shame we didn't have them before. Right. There's plenty spaces, like there's plenty of spaces. Not only is it a safety issue, but it sort of ruins the feeling of an area. You don't want to be around it as a person. You sense that it's dangerous or loud, that if the street is too wide and there's too much speeding. Like I think a good example in Cleveland, if you look at West 25th, sort of over by Market Square, where the street really narrows, it's a very fun, pleasant place to walk. But if you go over to West 25th, over by Detroit, it spreads out to like 15 lanes, and it's just like a people repellent, sort of. And businesses over there haven't been able to succeed as well. And there's just all this unnecessary asphalt. So yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of opportunities that have come from this. But I think some of that, I think the traffic has sort of picked up, unfortunately.
Yes.
So it's not as much of an issue as it was.
Yeah, I'll never forget when we were at Cleveland City Hall, the mayor of Bogota came to see us, and he said, paraphrasing, but he essentially said, the street's not my problem, the sidewalks are my space, and I want as much sidewalk space as I can have. And the point is there was this tussle between street and sidewalk, but maybe he was ahead of the game that we're now in, which is extending out for reasons we could have never predicted because of pandemic that's needed the spacing. But let's perhaps make it here to stay, you know. And it's interesting, I mean, with this whole issue and the discussion about where are we going to come out relative to need for space, office space and other things. When you look at Central Business District as an example, one of our associates this summer Caroline is here from Cornell on a summer associateship. She said to me, what about it sort of as a central social space, kind of reclaiming space just in the times we're in and thinking about infrastructure because the real estate demand may not be as much.
Yeah. One thing I think is sort of disappointing about the United States is it seems like every other culture has these plazas, public plazas.
Right.
Like you go to Europe, you go to Latin America, and there's a gathering space, and we sort of don't have that anymore. Like all of our public spaces have been privatized, and maybe that has to do with sort of the way our society is splintering right now and causing huge problems. And loneliness and a lot of things.
Well, we'll start here. We've got 100 some planners on the line here, or interested planning fans that have chimed in. And I'm going to go to something that was said to me earlier this week, and it came up in the chat questions here. It is a question from one of our partner engineers here in town who says, has there been an analysis of correlation between the rising pedestrian deaths and increases in both distracted driving and distracted walking due to the use of mobile devices? And I think the spirit of that is also, it's a no pun intended, two-way street, drivers and pedestrians with devices and distraction. What do you think of that? I mean, that 10-year uptick seems correlative to the explosion also of devices.
Yeah, so I talk about that in the book. That's everyone's top theory when I talk about this, distracted driving and sometimes distracted walking too. I don't think distracted walking is a big factor. It may be a factor. The reason I don't think it is most pedestrian deaths occur at night. Pedestrian deaths are concentrated among low-income groups. I think we have sort of like an imaginary sense of who is getting killed while walking. It's not like the really tired guy in DC crossing the road, the like young urban professional. It's more like the guy in the photo running across the street in North Homestead.
Fair enough.
So there, for certain reasons, I don't think pedestrian distraction is a big problem. It's a little harder to say with driver distraction. I say it's definitely probably a factor, but one thing we can say, well, we know that people drive distracted all the time. We know that for a fact, that almost everyone who has a smartphone is using it almost every time they drive. And we know that's very dangerous. So, but we haven't seen deaths, we haven't seen fatalities between drivers increase during this time. So that doesn't seem to totally explain it. And also, some of our peer nations, Canada and Europe, have seen pedestrian deaths decline during this same period. And they have about the same level of market penetration with smartphones. So it's sort of hard to say because we just don't have very good data about it. Like most people who wreck their car don't say, I was on my phone. And most cops who don't really do thorough accident investigations when there's a crash. So it's a little bit hard to say, and it probably is a factor, but there's a lot going on. And I think it's a combination of factors, including more dangerous cars and some demographic changes, including migration to the Sun Belt, which we know is the most dangerous place for pedestrians.
You bring up that issue of report, and we wonder sometimes because we have a lot of interface with various law enforcement agencies, including our own, and I think there is some concern about the levels of reporting, and I'm a little bit suspect to that 20 persons a year in Cuyahoga County, but we'll see. It just seemed that was issued to us by the medical examiner's office, officially deemed, but how many actually get reported that are non-fatalities that are involving a car? So I wanted to go to a little bit of chat here about Vision Zero. And again, you brought up Jeanette Sadekhan out of New York. I mean, there seemed to be this concurrent campaign to bring forth the Vision Zero, but also a placemaking move that would better assure pedestrian priority and safety. It seems you have to have both, the campaign to reduce, but also the infrastructure improvements to guarantee it. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's education, a combination of things. Tell us a little bit about, the history of Vision Zero, and then bring it right to Cleveland and where we are with our Vision Zero campaign, because clearly it's a discussion now in Cleveland because we've launched it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Vision Zero is a concept that emerged out of Sweden. I think it was in the 1990s. And it's again, like I'm trying to help people reframe the way they think about streets as being a place just for cars to go through. Other things can occur in streets that could be beneficial to society and are legitimate as well, including just trying to cross the street. Because sometimes pedestrians struggle for even, that. But this is a reframing too, a big reframing. And it talks about so in the United States, our our tradition in traffic safety was to like count how many fatalities there were last year. If there was 38,000 fatalities last year, they would say, we're going to aim for 5% lower. So we're going to try to have 35,000 traffic fatalities last year. And there was a very innovative guy in charge in Sweden, and he said, what if he said that's morally, it's morally wrong.
Low common denominator, right? Yeah.
Design
for just a few days
that we know will kill people. Yeah. And there was actually a crash there that killed some people, and he said, we need to remove this obstacle that they crashed into. And they said, no, because that would be admitting responsibility. And his thing was that system designers bear responsibility for those fatalities that take place. In the United States, when we have a crash and someone is killed, we try to pin the blame on one of either the driver or the pedestrian, right? They messed up. But people mess up all the time. People make mistakes. We spend so much time driving. We're not perfect. So in Sweden, the idea was, let's design our systems so that even if people make mistakes, nobody is killed or seriously injured. So the idea has caught on. It's a best practice now across the world. And there's 40 US cities at least that have adopted Vision Zero plans, including Cleveland. And actually Cleveland's is doing great. Like, I'm impressed with, they haven't been around that long, only a few years. Matt Zone, who's a councilman, has been sort of one of the big advocates, and they're making great recommendations and making some progress, I think. So it's exciting to see. They're bringing in the right people from City Hall. So that's what it's going to take. It's going to take some recognition that there's a problem and also some effort and resources into resolving it.
You know, I have a slew of questions about advocacy, and I am really glad you referenced our only 2 years or 3 years young transportation program here, because it's at least been my observation that little things add up to matter. That view shed at the curb in Little Italy that Annie referenced, that gives the pedestrian a view of what's coming, and vice versa with the motorist. Those little things just add up. You know, today we installed more bike racks in University Circle. That's a welcome invitation for a more multimodal place. You're now entering into the world of consulting. I love 3MPH. If it wasn't clear, it took me a minute, but 3 miles per hour, 20-minute walk a mile. What would you consult communities about as it relates to moving their needle in this world of transportation equity? I realize that's loaded.
I think that's right. That's some of the little details. Like, we wouldn't build a highway, right? We wouldn't build a highway and just leave off an essential piece of safety infrastructure, right? We wouldn't just like have a highway and not have stripes in the middle, or not have side guards where they were needed, where there was a cliff. You know, we make sure everything that drivers have, they need, everything they need, they get for the most part.
Yes.
But we have a very two-tiered system in the United States where, you know, a lot of people, if you're driving a car, you're accommodated, and the system is top notch, okay, from a national standpoint. But if you're not, if you're relying on transit, if you're biking, if you're walking, it's very second rate. It's very dangerous and very incomplete for most folks. And there's some sweet spots, but for the most part, and even those, I think University Circle is a little bit of a sweet spot, but you go one street over and there's, you know, some of the stuff you're trying to address where it can get really scary for folks. So I'm a little bit losing my train of thought. Oh, so one of the things I want to do is do pedestrian safety audits. And like I mentioned, some of the folks who are in positions of influence, who sit on city councils, who, you know, negotiate the budget, they are never in this position where they're getting off a bus with 2 kids and having to cross like an 8-lane road. So it's not even on their radar. They may not have ever even experienced the street from that perspective. And that's sort of what 3MPH was supposed to be about, is about seeing the world from that perspective. And we need to go back to our streets and fix the things that are missing, like curb ramps for wheelchair users. If wheelchair users don't have a curb ramp and they're out in the street, that's a big problem. It's very dangerous. That's a problem everywhere. If bus riders don't have bus shelters and it starts to rain, well, then they're waiting under the awning of a business across the street and trying to sprint across when the bus comes, because it only comes once an hour, and they're getting hit. So it's those little kinds of things, and it takes a lot of local knowledge. That's one of the things that the pedestrian safety audit, you work with the community and you talk to the people using the street. What are the problems from your perspective? What are you experiencing when you're trying to just go about your day and get to where you need to go?
You know, there's a question related in the chat here about how we actually get back community feedback from pedestrians in order to improve infrastructure? I mean, I think that's a great question, because you walk your dog any morning and you think about that should be this or this should be that. I once did it and somebody said, don't say that on Twitter. It just, why not, right? But I mean, I'm as a pedestrian and as a walker in Cleveland, what would be a good catchment for my feedback, or any of ours that's on the call today, or our communities that we serve? How can we get pedestrians engaged in the feedback loop?
I think there's a lot of barriers to participation in planning processes for folks who are dependent on buses that come every half hour or every hour. They're very time crunched, right? So my philosophy is go out and meet them where they are in the field. Talk to folks on the sidewalk, talk to folks at the bus stop, and if you can, pay them for their time.
You and I both went to Cleveland State. I got to channel Norm Krumholtz once in this program, but he always said to me, planner's job is not always behind the desk. Got to go out and meet them.
Yeah, I think like it could be a barrier. That's another, so a barrier is coming to a meeting for folks, for a single mom, right? Who works 2 jobs. Another barrier is even having the time to spend 20 minutes on something that isn't relevant to your absolute necessities. So that's why I think, if we ask people for their time, especially if I was as a consultant getting paid for it, if we ask people to help us, that they deserve to be sort of compensated for their time, and that can eliminate.
There you go. I have just 2 more questions. Somebody asked about how MPOs, for those that don't know, MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization, how they can help in this entire effort. And I know you've worked with MPOs here in the region like NOACA. So what would you say about MPO support for what we're trying to do?
Money.
Yeah, fair enough.
They need money. I think one of the reasons communities aren't doing this is because they're just not even conscious of it. They're just not even thinking about it in some cases. But the financial incentives aren't for this. So a little bit of money could go a long way on this stuff. Like state DOTs will send down millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to fix some little safety problem on a highway. And we're rebuilding these flyovers, and it's just like infinity money for that.
Right.
But if a school wants to do a pedestrian island in front of it so that the parent can let their kid walk to school, it's like we have to have a bake sale, There isn't the financial incentives aren't there for communities. And even like streetlights, I know there's a lot of communities that are trying to do the right thing that want streetlights in other states, and financing it can be an issue for them.
If I can go back to an earlier slide we presented at the beginning, there was a reason we said that. It's been a DIY city for a long time as it relates to federal sources of support. I wish we could all zoom in our questions to the presidential debate as they're in our neighborhood here in a couple of months. But it likely won't come up, and so I think this has to come up locally, and local improvements are where it's at, and local advocacy on what's on your own block. And I think, I appreciated your enthusiasm for what is happening in this region, from this neighborhood to the city at large in the region. Good things are happening. It's just, as Carl Stokes once said to me, and it haunts me, change comes in inches, and we just got to accelerate it. Yeah. Somebody in the chat did say it's been remarkable how during COVID in such a short period of time, we've made transformation happen out of necessity, right? Because of the regulations of social distancing. If you were going to offer one thing, and I don't want to steal the thunder of your book, I want everybody to go out and get right of way, but what's the points you're trying to make in right of way? What's the overall and your thesis of right of way? Or you can tell us, go buy the book.
Yeah. I think it's about inequality, basically. Whose safety is worth the money? And I think that's where we've gone wrong, and it ties in with some of the discussions we're having about racism and inequality. And this is one way. There's plenty of ways. And I'm not the top expert on racial equality, of course, but I think we need to change the way we do business in our cities and start thinking about folks that have less and folks who've been discriminated against, and how can we make them whole, and how can we better serve their needs.
I thought today when our team here at UCI and UCPD donated 24 bikes to the students in 2 neighborhoods in Huff and Glenville, my mental anxiety went to, we've just given the bikes, the kids were riding away literally with parents just on their trip out. I just thought about what's the community that they ride in relative to the infrastructure and how supportive we can be. I think we just have to find it within ourselves to create more supportive multimodal infrastructure here in the city of Cleveland. And we will. I know you're an optimist too, and really grateful you joined us today. If you've got any parting thoughts and advice for all of us enthusiasts who wouldn't have joined you if we didn't believe in the fact that transportation is going to transform our city. Any parting thoughts and advice?
Yeah, I think one of the things I realized writing this book is, we're such a diverse, I think that our needs are so diverse.
Yeah.
There's people that's needs haven't been considered, haven't been front and center. There's a certain kind of person, their needs have really been centered. So we have to be thinking about, and not just spaces, but people, and how to make their lives better.
Yeah. It is the year 2020, and this is the year. It's always been, but it's in front of us in the moment of truth. I want to thank you for joining us and kicking off a wonderful kickoff to a 4-part series. I want to invite you back to listen in with the rest of our speakers that are going to follow you, hard act to follow. But I want to invite all of our attendees back, as you saw, and if you look at universitycircle.org and our partner Hugo and APA Cleveland, stay tuned. We're going to have 3 more in this series on transportation in the modern era, mobility in the modern era, we call it, and we look forward to having you back. Thank you for your work. Buy Angie's book, Right of Way, and thanks for being with us today, Angie, and all those who attended today for our first of the 4-part series. We'll see you soon at the next segment. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.